Hello, my dear parishioners. Today I want to tell you the story of St. Stephen Harding. St. Stephen Harding was born in England in the 11th century, and he went to school at the Abbey of Sherborne in Dorset, which is in the southern part of England. And after that Catholic education that he received, he decided to go on and see the world and travel and maybe study some more. And so he went to Scotland. He went to Paris, and his main trip was to Rome with a friend. On his way back from that trip to Rome with that friend, he was traveling through the forest of Burgundy in France when they came across a group of men, some monks, who had dedicated their lives to God in such a way in that it really caught St. Stephen Harding's attention, the way in which they prayed so intensely, which their mortification and their austerity, their life of poverty was so intense, how they lived off the land, how they worked themselves to make their own food and provide for themselves. It struck him so much that he in fact wanted to dedicate his life to that. So he said goodbye to his friend, who went off back to England, and St. Stephen Harding stayed there in France under St. Robert, who was abbot then, and under St. Alberic, who was prior, or the second in command, at the monastery there in Malem in France. And after some years there, together, all three of these men, who were all saints now, St. Robert, St. Alberic, and St. Stephen Harding, they began to realize that that initial spirit that St. Stephen Harding had seen in this group of men had begun to dwindle, had begun to diminish, had become more worldly and less heavenly. And they didn't like that. They didn't want that. They wanted to keep their hearts with God in heaven. And so the three men got together, discussed it, and decided that with those who wanted to, they would go and found a new monastery to live that new spirit, to follow our Lord with the authentic way in which they had initially chosen to and wanted to. So they went to the proper authorities. They got their permission and they left Malem and they went to Citeaux. When they reached Citeaux, St. Robert, St. Alberic, St. Stephen Harding, and 20 other monks, the prospects were a little bit gloomy. The place was dismal. They didn't have anything. But they talked to the Duke of Burgundy, and he gave them land. He gave them some workers. He gave them some material to build, and that they did. They built a monastery. And shortly after it was built, it turns out that back at the former monastery in Malem, they were demanding that Robert return. We don't know all of the details of exactly what happened, but they were demanding that Robert return, and he did. And so Robert left Citeaux and left St. Alberic in charge. And for 10 years, Alberic was in charge, and St. Stephen Harding was the prior, or the second in charge. And after those 10 years had passed, St. Alberic died. And after that, St. Stephen Harding was elected abbot. He became abbot, and immediately, because of that desire to put God first in everything, he took two measures, which were not so well received, to be honest. The first measure was that no wealthy men, no noblemen were allowed to come in and dine with them or to visit them at the monastery. And so that, first of all, made the finances much more difficult, because if the noblemen and the wealthy men couldn't go in and have dinner or just socialize, well, they wouldn't give money either. And so the finances became much more difficult. However, the men were able to dedicate themselves more to God. The second measure that St. Stephen Harding took was to make all of the decorations more simple in the Cistercian way. Even to this day, this is maintained. The Cistercians have a very simple way of decorating. You won't see any grand and ornate decorations. Everything is minimal, and it has its own beauty. But at this time, when he first made this change to being more minimal, to doing things in a more simple way, it was not well received. And so after a time, as monks started leaving, as people started going away, St. Stephen Harding, whose only idea was to put God first, was wondering, well, have I done wrong? Have I failed completely in this endeavor? Do I need to just, well, close the doors and say we're done? And right when he thought everything was about to be finished, when he thought he had made a big mistake, and of course he had not, God was simply putting him to the test. One day, a knock on the door was heard, and off went St. Stephen Harding. He opened the door, and there was a man full of fire, full of love of God, St. Bernard. And with him were 20, 30 noblemen, all saying, we want to live your life. We want to live a life dedicated to Jesus Christ, and we have no conditions. The only condition is that there are no conditions, to love God with all our hearts. With the arrival of St. Bernard and his family and friends and all those who wanted to give their lives to Jesus Christ with him, the monastery began to grow rapidly. So rapidly that they saw that they needed to split the community and found new ones. And so St. Bernard was sent by St. Stephen Harding to Clairvaux to found a new monastery. Several others were founded as well. But Stephen Harding was the one who brought them all together, who made the rules for how they should live, who gave them that spirit of how they should all work together as a community, as a family of Jesus Christ, and the laws, the way of life in which they should live. This is the founding of the Cistercian order. And the Cistercians are here to this day. To this day, we have the Cistercian nuns even close by here in Sauk City. I've been there to say Mass and to hear confessions to those nuns myself, and they're very wonderful. They're very, very good. They are women dedicated to God. Later, the feminine branch was founded, the Cistercian nuns. The Trappist monks are also a reform of the Cistercians, and we have them here also in Dubuque. Let us then pray to St. Stephen Harding that he bless us and that he give us that same spirit of always seeking Jesus Christ first. If you want to learn more about this story, make sure you read the book 3 Religious Rebels, which is a wonderful and exciting read, and the link to that you will find in the description below. God bless.